Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you are joining us from. And welcome to the Achieving Net Zero Global Metals and Mining panel. Our panel today was organized by the Climate Governance Initiative Russia and is co-hosted by Deloitte CIS. We'd like to give a warm welcome to you all and to extend our thanks to CGI Russia for their help in organizing this event. For the delegates joining the call, please note that we do have an option for simultaneous translation, and that's included in the toolbar at the footer of the Zoom call. So by way of introduction, my name is Ian Colborne, and I'm the CEO of Deloitte CIS, and I have been asked to offer a few opening remarks. Deloitte's an intellectual partner with CGI Russia, not only because we take climate change seriously, but because this partnership is an excellent opportunity to drive systemic change as part of the climate agenda. As the world's largest professional services firm, we recently launched our World Climate Strategy, which will enable us to drive responsible climate choices, both within our own organization and beyond. And for Deloitte, climate change is not a choice, it's billions of them. We all realize that climate change is reshaping today's world, giving rise to various risks and opportunities for businesses. Investors, regulators, and other stakeholders are now challenging companies to take responsibility by adopting an integrated strategic approach to addressing the climate emergency. And amid the calls for mining companies to reduce their impacts on the environment, organizations in the industry have started exploring ways to move beyond risk identification and mitigation towards execution of their decarbonization agendas. And this is critical if companies wish to meet the mandates associated with their environmental, social, and governance commitments, as well as to maintain the trust of investors and to secure the social license to operate. So during today's panel, we'll discuss how metals and mining companies plan to elaborate strategies and modify their operations in order to remain prominent players in the global economy, successfully adapting to both climate change and the new regulatory environment. So let me turn now to introduce our panel, where our speakers include Edward Dowling, Chairman and Independent Director at Polyus, Eduardo Bartolomeo, the CEO at Vale, Tony Hayward, Non-Executive Chairman at Glencore, and Tom Palmer, President and CEO at Newmont Corporation. And finally, to our moderator, Gillian Davidson, who's currently a Non-Executive Director at New Gold Inc. and at Central Asia Metals, where she chairs the sustainability committees at both boards. And previously, Dr. Davidson was the head of metals and mining at the World Economic Forum and was formerly the head of social responsibility at Teck Resources. So with the introductions now concluded, allow me to once again thank all of our partners at CGI Russia. By joining our efforts, we believe we can make a significant contribution to the climate agenda. I'm very much looking forward to the panel. And now, Gillian, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ian. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. And we have quite an exceptional panel with 4 of the global industry leaders from the mining and metals sector, as you've introduced. And I'm particularly eager to hear this conversation myself, as I sit on board of directors navigating many of these climate conversations today. And if you've been engaged in the summit, or if you're engaged in the area of climate governance, I'm sure, as Ian has said, you hear a number of very clear and consistent messages that will frame our discussion today. One is around the increasing pressure, as Ian said, from investors, governments, customers, societies around decarbonisation. But at the same time, we're hearing the urgent call for this greater clarity on the intentions and the roadmaps of how to get there. And I'm keen to explore that with our speakers today. The second thing is that we're hearing that the boardroom is often grappling with this quite disruptive nature of the relationship between business and climate change, and our growing duty of the boards in regards to oversight and stewardship, and what does that look like? And for the mining and metals sector, we're seeing really great increasing engagement and responses around action to climate change. But the sector is also at a very important and somewhat complex position, I think, in this climate debate and discussions. And I'm sure we'll hear that come through from our speakers today as well. You know, as countries and industries decarbonize and we push for these low carbon technologies, the mining and metal sector finds themselves right at the heart of the solution of the demand for these energy transition metals, from electric vehicle batteries to hydrogen fuel cells to wind turbines, metal recycling, and so on. But on the other hand, we're also a significant emitter of GHG, accounting for 47% of global emissions, and majority of that being as a result of coal mining. So in this context, I'm really looking forward to this conversation and exploring with all of you as major leaders in this sector, how do we approach climate governance? How do we embed climate action? And how do we interpret this fiduciary duty in the boardroom? So with that framing, I'd like first to turn to Eduardo Bartolomeo from Vale. Eduardo, you're the CEO of one of the largest iron ore nickel producers in the world, and you've made a commitment to net zero by 2050. And I think very interestingly, have committed 2 billion investment over 10 years. I'd love to have heard those boardroom conversations on that investment. Could you share with us a bit about that climate change journey, about the goals, and about the leadership dynamic that took place? And especially, we're really interested in the role of leadership and cultural transformation that's required to get a company as major as yours on this road to net zero.
Okay, good day to all. I think, first of all, thanks for the CGI to host me here and let the opportunity to talk to you about what Vale is all around the climate change and the climate governance. And of course, Gillian and Ian Colburn for holding it, leading us through this conversation. I think before talking, I'll start answering the second part of the discussion. I think the second part of your question. First of all, I think the world is going through a transformation because of the pandemic. The pandemic has pushed us, the boardroom and shareholders, to demand more, as you mentioned before, more commitments to the climate change. A big example is the BlackRock. BlackRock is one of our shareholders that's pushing for more concrete examples how we are dealing with the climate change. And second is the society needs as well. I think there's a lot of need for more purpose from organizations. But I cannot start talking about cultural transformation without saying a word about Brumadinho. Brumadinho was an event in 2019 that shook the company. It was a wake-up call. Actually, in January 2019, we lost 270 people. That created a wake-up call much in advance to Vale. I arrived in March, took office in April, and with that in mind, we were actively listening what's going on. Together with leading with the problem, we were leading with what is next. And was fundamentally to see to us that we need to transform ourselves. And we embedded together with our shareholders and our board members, 2 new pillars in our strategy. One called safety and operational excellence, that is unnecessary to explain why. And the other is a new pact to society. What does that mean, this new pact to society? That was actually brought to the public attention in May on the Barcelona event. It's when Vale said, we want to go beyond repairing, beyond serving our territories, to have a real presence in the governance of climate governance, because it's a need for society. What I want to say is from the very place of the accident to the society as a whole. So that's the new pact that we want to embed. This new pact demands a more concrete action from Vale. In the end of 2019, we announced our very strong, actually we upgraded our target goals to turn ourselves in carbon neutrality to 2050, as mentioned here. We went to Scope 1 and 2 that we had already announced a target in 2018 to 33%, aligned with the Paris Agreement. And of course, we had to concretely show that. And then I think I'll pass to the how we deal with that, how we are going tactically with this subject. At Vale, we first of all, we set the goals from the board. The board set the goals and followed the goals. This is in my team, short-term variable remuneration and long-term compensation. We were one of the first miners to embed long-term compensation on CHG goals. And we have a low carbon forum that we embed all of these needs, because if you understand, when you get to your company, say we have to reduce 33% of your scope 1 and 2, we actually don't know how to do that. That demands a transformation, an innovation that has to go through the whole organization. Vale is a large one, as you mentioned before. It's 130,000 people that we have to touch. And we're doing that through this forum, for example. And this creates a virtual cycle in a way that we are following, creating innovations. Fundamentally, giving even more detail, as you mentioned, as you asked before, we're looking at renewables. That's the $2 billion that you mentioned in the beginning. We are committed to have 100% of our energy coming from clean source in 2030, 2025 in Brazil. That is all about the 200. We're talking about energy efficiency on our railways, on our palletizing plants, on our nickel plants. We are talking about biofuel substitution, and that's an electrification, of course. So that's all the four. We have a MAC curve that we, by the way, we were in the few companies that had the, I would say, the transparency to show the MAC curve. We have over 35 projects undergoing to arrive to this goal. So if I try to summarize my answer, we won't change if we don't have a transformation inside the company. Vale had an opportunity, due to the Brumadinho strategy, to start earlier, to be more open to society, to listen more carefully. But at the same time, with the support of our board, we made the whole chain like be aligned with the goals, with the metrics, with the long-term objectives. So in a nutshell, I think from the transformation, from the culture, from the strategy, from the goals, I think Vale is pretty well aligned, because as mentioned, we have an alignment from our shareholder, our board members, and our executive team. And of course, we won't do that without our people with technology innovation, and of course our clients. I'll come back later with the scope 3, because I think it's another very important subject on how we shape the industry itself. I'm talking a lot about Vale now, but if we have a chance, we can talk about our clients as well. I hope I don't overrun the time.
No, not at all. Thank you, Eduardo. Actually, we've still got a little bit of time left. I would like to follow up on something that you said, and it's about this alignment. And you were really setting the tone from the top. Could you say something a little bit about how easy was it to get that alignment, or how difficult was it?
I think, first of all, I was the first one that was impacted. It was a board member that came to me and said, look, Eduardo, you have a huge benefit from your clean energy in Brazil. We have 1 million hectares of forest that we protect in the Amazon and in Brazil and elsewhere. Why don't you lead this thing? Why don't you? So it was a push from my board that said, look, you have the opportunity to lead. So Vale has a clean energy. So I think was fundamentally myself that was, and of course I have to engage my team on that. But when you talk something that brings innovation, brings something that is good for society, it's not hard to get people. And the guy said, look, it's 2030. You have time to think. That was the first time I opened my mind. I said, look, yeah, of course, but we're committed. That's why I'm an engineer. So I need to be in touch, in control. So I said, we will show the MAC curve. We will do the projects. There's a lot of investments. I forgot to mention, we set a carbon price, of course, to lead us through this process. So I think it's a matter, and we were very sensitive. I think Vale was, as I mentioned before, due to Brumadinho, very open to listen and to change. So I think that in a way, in an awkward way, it makes us open to change, open to transformation, and I think was not that hard, because you're doing the right thing.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. So interesting taking a journey from what was probably crisis within the organization through to looking at opportunity. But what you've spoken to is really the breadth of holistic thinking that's also needed, thinking from your product to your supply chain, to how you operate, to the stakeholders you work with. So thank you very much for that.
Okay,
Edward
thank you.
Dowling, let me turn to you, Chair of Polyus. You are the largest gold producer in Russia, one of the largest in the world, and I think just 2 weeks ago released a climate position statement, which was approved by the board of directors. So we would love to hear about what that road tour looked like for you, how you approached this, how you thought about milestones and targets and actually getting on this journey to carbon reduction.
Well, thank you, Gillian, and the opportunity to present here today. This has been a journey for some number of years now, but it all starts with the recognition that this is a governance matter, and good governance leads to superior total shareholder returns. Taking action on climate change is something all of our stakeholders expect us to do. Working to decrease the company's carbon footprint and managing climate risk isn't a sidebar job, it is the new normal. As seen by the remarkable growth in ESG signatories, it's also a seminal priority for our investors. Climate change is a key element of any sustainability agenda, and sustainability must be an important activity for any corporation. Today, being sustainable is not only about attracting new investors, it's about not losing the ones you already have. In short, it's about doing the right thing and maintaining access to capital. Polyus recognizes the need for climate risk management as well as the importance of transparency and shareholder this issue. The company operates exclusively in Siberia and the far east of Russia, and a considerable portion, about 40%, of the company's operation are located in permafrost areas. Additionally, changing in precipitation regimes, especially increased summer rainfalls and related risks such as forest fires, high winds, etc., is important because of the potential effects on logistics, which is so important to us being far flung, and regional infrastructure, things like bridges and roads, etc., and vulnerabilities, as well as our production processes themselves, and on the quality of wastewater, which we need to treat. The company's been taking a variety of initiatives to reduce its carbon intensity over some period of time. Polyus continually implements various initiatives across the business using advanced tools and technologies to minimize emissions, involving employees, different programs to reduce the impacts on climate change, and over the past several years made impressive progress in reducing our carbon footprint. From 2015 to 2019, Polyus has reduced the carbon intensity production by more than 45%. That's from 0.16 tons of CO2 equivalent per ton of ore processed to 0.73 ton per ton. Last month, Polyus signed an agreement to switch its largest production cluster, which is in the Krasnoyarsk region, to hydropower. Today, 90% of electrical demand by the company's production assets is supplied or will soon be supplied with renewable resources. With few exceptions, this is higher than most global mining companies. In 2015 is when we really started working on this. We became the first publicly to declare its commitment to international climate goals. We've learned along the way, as I mentioned, it's a journey. We've come to a conclusion that a systematic approach to address these issues requires a proper risk assessment as a prerequisite. As such, we're currently analyzing the results of a climate risk assessment conducted last year during 2020. And based on these risk findings, a climate strategy is being developed to include relevant policies and instruments which are currently being developed and will be implemented and integrated across the company's operations and business units. As you mentioned, indeed, we've recently approved and published our key strategic priorities, including climate change, and the strategy will cover these, among many other things, minimizing our footprint in terms of cutting Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, diminishing our share of coal in the energy mix, which we've already made some good progress on, improving efficiency of our existing operations. Our longer-term plans will include the development of Scope 3 approach to emissions and accounting towards carbon neutrality. At the same time, we have to manage the risk at our existing operations, and that's going to be careful monitoring of changes and its effects in terms of air temperature, extreme events such as wind and rain, thawing permafrost, regulatory changes, market risk. This is all accompanied by a commitment to disclosure and transparency, i.e. recording, for example, in accordance with the new TCFD recommendations, starting in our 2020 sustainability report, which will be published soon, as well as developing a disclosure system in accordance with best practice. Another area of importance is cooperating with our stakeholders. We want to participate in climate-related initiatives and activities as key industry think tanks, not unlike what's going on here today, in cooperation with our stakeholders, that's employees and contractors and suppliers and peers. Effectively, our climate position statement is an official statement of a commitment to global sustainability principles. It is an important milestone for the company and our climate strategy. We're working now on our long-term climate strategy, which we expect to be completed this year. This will help us develop the voluntary goals on greenhouse reduction efforts and be able to set meaningful targets that can be accomplished and set those by the end of this year. Finally, I'm pleased to report progress is being made, as demonstrated by publication earlier this week of our water report. This is the first water report produced by Polyus, as well as any Russian corporate. So thank you, Jillian. I appreciate the opportunity to participate. That includes my initial remarks.
Great, thank you, Edward. I think some really key points that I think plays out in the mining sector a lot, and I think Eduardo touched on them as well. But again, it's about this holistic approach, thinking about water, thinking about biodiversity, thinking about climate, that they all intersect around many of our global assets. And you're sitting in a very extreme weather location with that. Maybe just one other quick question. You obviously understand this very well. Was there an education process that the board had to go through or is going through? Is that something that had to happen to allow this strategy to be developed?
I'd say it's a bit of both. And probably the co-speakers would probably agree with that. You know, we've had board education on ESG and sustainability and in the boardroom itself about what does this mean, what's it really all about. I don't know if I've been in a board meeting anywhere in the last 4 years where ESG was not a topic. And, but I'd say probably more of the learning has come by doing. And, you know, like I said, we found along the way that to really get meaningful results on this, we have to really base it on what the risks really are and the materiality of those risks associated. And that gives you the priorities to focus on to really address.
Thank you so much, Edward. Tony Hayward, if I could turn to you now, Chairman of Glencore, one of the world's largest globally diversified natural resource companies, I think over 150 sites globally. You are across the energy transition metals, copper, cobalt, zinc, nickel, probably more. But you're also on the other side of the equation in thermal and coke and coal. You have set the net zero target to 2050 and an ambitious roadmap. It'd be great to hear from you about how did Glencore approach that as such a large diversified company, both mining and trading, and what was the role particularly for you as the chairman? Sorry, Tony, you're still on mute. Thank you.
Yeah, let me start again. Gillian, thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation to be here, everyone. It's great to have the opportunity to listen and learn and share some of our lessons along the way. As Gillian observed, Glencore starts this journey with a foot very firmly in two camps. We are one of the largest producers of copper and nickel, and we are the largest producer of cobalt and zinc. And they're, of course, all essential for the energy transition. And on the other hand, we are the largest producer of seaborne thermal coal today. So we also have a major fossil fuel business. I think we looked at this in a very holistic way, and I think it is the only way to do so. Like most miners, 90% of our emissions come from the use of our products, and only 10% of our carbon footprint is from our own operations. So we believe very strongly that any strategy to address climate change must address the totality of a company's carbon footprint, not only scope 1 and 2, but also scope 3 from the use of our products. And as Gillian observes, at the end of last year, we set out a strategy to reduce our total emissions by 40% by 2035 and to achieve net zero by 2050. And we're one of the, I think, earliest companies in the sector to do so. The strategy has got 4 components. The first is to oversee the managed decline of our coal business. In essence, we are liquidating the coal business and reinvesting the cash flow into our base metal business to grow that in line with demand as the world's demand for transition metals increases. In terms of coal, production peaked at 138 million tonnes in 2019. It's fallen significantly over the last few years, and it will continue to decline. And I would expect that we will be out of coal by the probably early 2040s. Alongside that, we're obviously focused on our own operations. We are progressively electrifying our mining operations. We have a new nickel development in Sudbury, which will be entirely electric. Again, I think it's one of the first fully electric underground mine developments to take place. We've have been and continue to implement low carbon and renewable energy in our mining operations worldwide. In our Arctic mine in Canada, we've got wind power, and some of our key copper operations in Africa are powered by hydro, and it's something that we'll continue to develop. And I suppose ultimately, we expect to have to make use of carbon capture and sequestration. In Australia, we're progressing a major carbon capture and sequestration scheme. And I suspect ultimately for the final few, perhaps tens of tonnes, we will be required to use offsets. All of that program is driven by a company-wide MAC curve, internal carbon pricing, and we're reporting fully compliant with the TCFD. I think what I'd say in respect to how does it all come together? How did it all come together? Climate strategy is fundamental to the strategy overall of any mining company. In fact, I would say that climate strategy is likely to define the overall strategy of mining companies, and many companies, in fact, for several decades. So you would expect the board and chairman to be intimately involved in development of those strategies. In the case of Glencore, something we've been working on really for some years, going back to, in fact, the run-up to the last big climate summit in Paris in 2015. We set up a climate change working group, which I chaired. It involved the CEO, senior business and functional leaders from across the business. And it sort of met on a regular basis, but in a rather informal way, to explore and test ideas and strategies. It's been a very effective way for us of developing a climate strategy and ensuring that we had broad-based buy-in to the approach we're taking. I mean, obviously, some of the things that we are doing are quite significant, and ensuring that there's broad-based buy-in across the firm has been really important. I think the other thing that I'd highlight is that we have been very conscious to very actively engage shareholders as we've gone through this journey. It's been a sort of regular feature of the whole climate strategy development at Glencore. We've involved the various shareholder groups and obviously our own principal shareholders in the development of the strategy. That was it.
Great, thanks, Tony. It sounds as though you rolled your sleeves up yourself as chairman in these conversations. Do you think that was that a pivotal impact? Was that an important role for the chairman to play?
I would say it's sort of horses for courses here. I don't think there's a particular way of doing things. It's a way that worked well for us. I have some history and some experience and some background in the subject from my prior lives. So I was able to bring some knowledge to the space. But I think what I would say is that I think involvement of the board in whatever shape or form it takes is really important. Mm-hmm. Because, in essence, a company's approach to climate will define a company's strategy over the coming decades. That is, I think, very clear in many sectors, but it's certainly true in the mining sector.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, that the climate strategy is really company defining, I think is what you're saying. It's a real turning point for the industry. Thank you so much, Tony. Tom Palmer, if I could turn to you now, CEO of Newmont, largest gold company in the world. And you also, as a company, have set a target of net zero by 2050. And again, a very ambitious roadmap to 2030 in the first place. It'd be great to hear from you about some of those discussions you had as management, as CEO with your board of directors. How supportive was the board? How did those conversations go about targets and publicly disclosing those? Because that's often a very dynamic conversation in the boardroom. And what were the challenges that you saw in that journey and in achieving those targets?
Thanks, Gillian, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join this call today. And the themes at the Newmont board table are very similar to what Eduardo, Edward and Tony have shared today as well. Our discussion with the Newmont board is really a continuation of a journey that we started around 30 years ago on sustainability. And we started it because we had to. We left the shores of the United States in the 1990s and simultaneously went into Peru. The Shining Path was in its last days. We went into Indonesia at the same time, the last days of the Suharto regime, and we went into Uzbekistan. So we went offshore simultaneously in 3 difficult locations, and we learned some very hard lessons. And that's really shaped Newmont's agenda around sustainability for the last 30 years. We've incorporated those tough lessons into our approach, and particularly our approach to governance. And I'd agree with Edward that if you don't have strong governance in place, then you won't get sustainable performance. One of the strengths of good governance is continuity. We turn 100 in May, and I'm only the 10th CEO at Newmont, and every appointment has been an internal succession. What that brings is continuity. So the programs and our approach that we put in place decades ago now, we continue through a process of internal succession. So I bring my own personality to the CEO role, but we have a theme that the board is governing in terms of our approach to sustainability. And an important part of that we've been doing for close to 20 years is transparency in our reporting and holding ourselves to account. Specifically around climate change, we started that journey around 10 years ago. We started to report our fuel consumption, our energy consumption, and our greenhouse gas emissions. And back in 2017, for the first time, we published greenhouse gas emission intensity reduction targets, 16.5% by 2020. So we achieved those last year, we closed them out. So to arrive at our 2030 targets and our 2050 targets was a continuation of that long discussion with our board. So it was fairly straightforward because of that journey that we'd been on. Our 2030 targets, 30% reduction, was evolutionary on our previous numbers. And we have a portfolio that as we move to underground and as we do some different things in our business plan, we get about 40% of that
just by doing the things that are already in our business plan. But we have to find the other 60% through other ways. And we committed $500 million over the next 5 years to invest in things within the business that can help us get there. That's renewables on our mine sites and also electrification. But we'll need another $900 million from move to renewables and us providing the base load, so $1.4 billion altogether to get to that 30% reduction. Those discussions around 2030 were very straightforward, and the commitment to that $500 million investment was a very straightforward discussion with our board. And they're clear on the things that we need to do. It's electrification. We have an underground mine in Ontario that's electrified today. It's automation. We have a mine we're commissioning an autonomous fleet in now. It's the move to renewables. It's fuel switching. It's all of those things. The pathway is not easy, but it's laid out for us. The challenging discussion with the board was the aspirational target around net zero by 2050. And for us as a gold mining company, for the first time, we're able to have a discussion where we could talk about something that far out into the future. And it was a consequence of two transformational transactions that we executed back in 2019. We changed our portfolio. We now have a portfolio of operations and an organic project pipeline that for a gold mining company, we can see out to 2050 and beyond. So it allowed us to have that conversation with the board around setting an aspirational target in 2050 to be net zero. And that probably takes me to the challenges, and there are three of them, and they're more around the 2050 timeframe than the 2030 timeframe. The first is technology. The technology exists to get to our 2030 targets, but it doesn't exist to get to net zero by 2050. So for us, it's about understanding what we need to do to be encouraging the development of our technology, to be understanding what we need to do differently with how we build and operate our mines in the future. So that's a key challenge for us and a key point of discussion with our board. The second one's the political challenges. The Economist had a great article in November and talked about the move from petrostates to electrostates. And as we move to net zero and even to move to our 2030 targets, we're going to rely upon energy coming from renewables. And we're already seeing examples in some of the jurisdictions in which we operate where governments are supporting state-owned enterprise, which aren't the most energy efficient sources of fuel, and preventing renewables coming into the system. And that's going to require us to engage with those governments, to collaborate with those governments, and to support a move to renewables where we're providing that base load. And the third one is probably more specifically around 2030. Our 30% reduction is to get us well below 2 degrees by 2030, or to manage that 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees. But there's a push to be only have the 1.5 degree temperature rise by 2030. If we move to that, if that becomes the challenge, that will require us to have a 50% reduction in our emissions by 2030, and understanding what that would mean for us as an organisation, and for us, understanding what the world looks like at 2050 helps us understand what we need to do to get to beyond 30% by 2030 in order to support that move if that's where the globe goes. Thanks, Gillian.
Great, thanks, Tom. And really interesting to hear that a lot of those conversations went potentially more smoothly than some would think, but it seemed that it was being able to project and understand what the company might be and look like in 2050. And that can be a challenge for a lot of other companies, especially perhaps in the mid-tier who don't have the life of mine and are still growing their business. And it's really interesting to hear that was a smoother process than I thought you would report back. Also, I thought a really interesting point, there's this shift, I guess, from the quarterly thinking to suddenly we're talking about 2050. And boards are often criticised for thinking on a quarterly results basis. I'd love to hear about, you talked about investors. I just want to pick up on that and see what shift are you seeing in the investment community in those conversations? Are they talking 2050 with you? Are they talking the next quarter? Are they talking about it all?
Yes, well, I've seen a marked change over the last 2 years with those investor discussions. It started in Europe, moved through the UK, and now in the United States and Canada, where you're less and less talking about your quarterly performance and the particular performance of an operation, to more around your ESG performance. So in Europe, some of the conversations are only on ESG performance and talking strategy and multi-year. So the dynamic of those conversations is changing significantly. And as I say, it started in Europe, but you're seeing it now start to move right through the investment community, and it is becoming it's not only just the specific. Can we have a separate ESG conversation? We're now seeing the first or second agenda item in meetings with investors being our ESG performance and what we're doing to set the bar to meet some of the challenges in front of us. I think it's clearly becoming an investment decision. Now, those organisations that are not serious, I don't think will be around at the end of this decade.
Great, thank you, Tom. Great message. Eduardo, if I could go back to yourself and actually picking up on some of the points that Tom made about there's a real there's a societal connection here. So mining is, we know our products are part of almost every value chain. We're part of so many sectors. We often have a role in helping reshape, economies and societies where we're present. What's your experience of how mining companies and leadership such as yourself can really help in that transition for whole economies towards carbon neutrality? What's the role that we have? Is it in partnerships? Is it working with government? Is it working with supply chains? Are you experiencing that?
Okay. Thanks, Gillian. I think in a nutshell, almost all of them. I think, first of all, if we want to reshape something, we have to commit ourselves. I think we did that. I mentioned that in my previous intervention when we announced the Scope 3. Vale is it's not exposed to coal as Glencore, for instance, but it's very exposed to the steel industry. I'm going to talk a little bit about those two industries and shipping. Just to have an idea, Scope 3 that we announced on 2020 is around 15% net liquid that we're going to revise to 2035. It's 160 million tons. Our Scope 3, 1 and 2 is around 600 million tons. So actually our Scope 1 and 2 is almost negligible. It's 2% of the whole chain. So if we want to really change something, we have to commit ourselves to commit our partners. Why we did that? First of all, because it's not as everybody else mentioned before me, it's a road with no way back. So we have to go after it. So we studied that. We have some advantages in our side because our portfolio, not talking about nickel, copper, or cobalt, but specifically on iron ore. And of course, as you mentioned before, we have to engage with our clients. That's an absolutely must to do it. So when we started to study the 15% on Scope 3, what came out to our site? We more or less mapped in a way that 25% could be brought by our own initiatives. With our high-grade iron ore, our agglomerates, we have a lot of initiatives that I think starts to touch on changing the way the industry goes. We are studying like HBI, hard briquetted iron, for instance, just an example. And we are together with our clients. We understand that is a way to go. When we talk specifically about the steel industry, it's the normal way that they see. You can understand how can we, how can I say, play this game together? They are going to circular. They're going to different fuels like hydrogen. They are going to energy efficiency. So we are dependent on that industry. We cannot lose the bus wagon. We have to be together with them. So we are together with our Chinese partners. We are together with Brazilian steel producers here. We are talking to the Europeans as well. We need to engage with them because it's a need. The steel industry has a much larger challenge than we do. But if we don't help them, we are in a bad shape in the future. So that's why, and I think Vale in a way positions itself in a good position because it has a high quality that will be needed in any scenario. Even if everybody thought, oh, iron ore is going to come down because of Chinese circular economy, and it's true. But the quality is going to be needed, yes. So we need to talk to them and help them to do this transition. Even if they go to hydrogen, it's even better for us. So I think that's the way we think specifically about the industry. If you go to shipping, for instance, we ourselves, we have 180 ships as we speak rolling in the seas because we attend both mainly Europe and China and Japan. So what can we do? We cannot just sit and wait what's going to happen in the shipping industry. We are talking intensively with ship owners, talking just now as we speak, we're doing air lubrication, we're doing rural sales, things that we are all out of the whack maybe 10 years ago, but we're talking actually about fuels, about ammonia, about LNG, and we're preparing our ships for that. So we are shaping in a way the shipping industry because we can shape the shipping industry and we can help shape the steel industry, the two that are most exposed to our scope 3. If I go a step after, as you mentioned, we are with our supply chain, with the Carbon Disclosure Project for 15 years. I think some of the people said here, it's not something I might maybe made an intention to say it started in 2018. No, all of us are in this journey for a long time. So the Carbon Disclosure Project for our supply chain helps them to give transparency. We, of course, need a voluntary market for carbon. I talked about carbon price for $50 and Vale to allow us to have a feasibility in our project. So we need actually to have this carbon market functioning. And of course, I think advocacy, as we're doing here. I think we need to talk. We need to actually play put your money where your mouth is. And I think, and lead the industry because we're gonna need each other in the future. As you said, I think it may be obvious for us here in the room, but we are the industry of the industries. We have be here regardless what we do. We're talking about a lot about copper. Is it copper's gonna, how can we supply copper to the market? The market will find a way to supply copper because of the electricity transition. So we need to look at that, and it's gonna be technology for sure, innovation for sure, and cooperation. I think the word that I would like, even when we discuss about that, there's a lot of internal discussions around how can you give targets to your clients. You're not giving targets to my clients. I need targets to myself that I have to help my clients. Because if I don't help my clients, I might be in dire needs in the future. So I think that, Gillian, in a nutshell, it's basically that. And I think you will reshape the industry. The industry is being reshaped as we speak. And I think the Chinese are extremely important to that as well, because 75% of the steel industry by chance is not by chance, by fact is in China today.
Yeah, that's a great point. And are you surprised by any new collaborations or partnerships that are evolving as part of this journey?
Yes, I forgot to mention, we just did an investment in Boston Metal. Is electrolysis in molten oxide at MIT, and we're doing it together with BHP. There's no, I think there's no why not to do that in cooperation with our competitors. It's because we want to have a feasible industry in the future. So we're looking at technology together with them. I think a lot of interest in Brazil with a specific client around agglomerates, how we can use energy. So some very exciting, but not, I think, how can I say, surprising, but everybody knows that. I think the biggest challenge here is how to do it feasibly. Regulatory regulation from government is going to be needed, because the challenge for the steel industry is not small. That's, I think, the basics of the discussion. And I think where we can break through there is going to be key to the success of myself, my company, and of course, the steel industry. Just an example, of course.
That's great insights. Thank you very much, Eduardo. A lot to think about. A lot of different players to think about there. And I did read somewhere that the miners of the future will be sitting in Silicon Valley, and we have to think about that.
Absolutely.
Edward, if I come back to you, you mentioned in your opening comments, thinking about risks and materiality and prioritization, and a lot of the work that the Climate Governance Initiative have been doing and looking at around principles really starts to get into that. Really, what does that oversight look like in some of these areas? And it'd be great to hear from you about, you know, what's your take on the board's role in these kind of management systems, assessing and evaluating risks, understanding materiality and priorities. What's been your experience?
Okay, well, thank you. You know, by definition, the company's board of directors is to set direction and serve as a source of expertise and strategic oversight. There's an old saying that I'm fascinated by what my boss is slightly interested in. And so setting the tone at the top, and establishing these priorities and allocating resources and ensuring transparency are really vital. You know, for our board, you know, we're actively involved. I mean, it starts in the boardroom and it goes to the change room at the mines when we get out there, and it goes from the change room right back to the boardroom. And the climate risks are an important factor for any mining company. You know, both part of the risk management system and as part of the wider corporate climate agenda. It's a task for the board to help the company navigate this in this transitionary period that we're in, and provide strategic guidance. As I said, it's a journey, but I'm not sure there's a destination. It's just a journey of a continuous improvement. I mean, everybody in mining understands that because we've always worked on that, but focusing on costs. Here it's a broader and perhaps a more impactful agenda. Then we want to integrate our climate risk management into our overall risk management systems. The board must ensure that the company's risk assessment when it comes to climate becomes systematic and an integral part of the company's overall risk management system. Climate change is another long-term factor, which we must take into consideration in managing and developing our operations. It must be reflected in the company's procedures, our policies, our framework, our investment criteria, and our internal standards. You know, materiality is an important thing, and I mentioned it before. The board must ensure that management has a clear understanding of the impact of climate change on the company's business, both in terms of its nature and its scale. Every mining company operates in unique conditions, you know, due to its local geology or local environment, where a portfolio of assets may be allocated in different geographic areas. And if you think about it for a second, if you take companies operating in, you know, drier parts of the world, just say Africa or parts of Africa or Australia, for example, climate change may create a risk of sustained drought. You know, dramatic shortages of water and extreme heat. This in turn creates additional issues and challenges on several levels. You know, from operations and technology challenges to operating in that like that, to potential tensions with local communities over allocation of scarce water, and to regional disruptions of supply chains. Polyus operates exclusively in Siberia and in the Russian Far East. And these regions are areas of excess water and are basically unpopulated. Therefore, droughts and water scarcity are not an issue that Polyus is facing, rather it's just the opposite. Our risks are with permafrost meltdown and changing precipitation patterns resulting in inundations of precipitation and those related effects. And more important, these are the important considerations that we're working towards. A proper climate risk assessment requires close attention to all the specifics of this company. The board, with its expertise and professional expertise you bring in to help a diverse setup, must ensure that the company gets a detailed picture of where we're headed from a perspective not that was different than the way we looked at things just a few years ago. Just a few last words on accountability and transparency. You know, with regard to accountability, climate risk as part of a wider climate agenda has become an important priority for our investors and shareholders. The shareholders want to see the company adapting its strategy to climate change and taking relevant steps, reflecting the risk and opportunities arising from the climate change. The board's role in this regard is to act as a competent intermediary between the company and its shareholders by translating the shareholders' expectation into adjustments on the company's strategy, management initiatives, and how we talk about it. In transparency, it's critical that the board implement the highest standards of disclosure in climate-related information. Transparency is a crucial part of a wider expectations from companies regard to the climate issues. Simple compliance with regulations and mandatory standards, including formal disclosure of information are far below the expectations of our stakeholders. Companies should commit to disclosure of climate risk related information in accordance with voluntary standards and frameworks such as the recent TCFD and the recommendations of many of the CDP protocols. Polyus, and specifically, is actively participating in the ratings from the CDP, and the company's sustainability report in 2020 will include information disclosed in accordance with the TCFD recommendations. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Edward. And I think that disclosure piece, I'm starting to hear it come up as a theme from all of you. And I think especially with the task force on climate disclosures, it's become a very active conversation. And, so just to go back to what you said, was that something that Polyus self-identified, that there was gaps in disclosure, or was it much more a conversation with your external stakeholders who were seeking more of that information, and you were responding to that?
Well, it's been more evolutionary, I'd say, as we've learned about this. And, it's not particularly that we found there were gaps. It's more just trying to understand the desires of our shareholders and stakeholders in terms of what's important to them and how do we comply with that in a honest and robust information.
That's great. Thank you very much, Edward. Appreciate that. Tony, if I turn back to you, as you said, you've been around the climate and energy space for a long time and have a lot of knowledge. And I'm just wondering, reflecting on what you've heard today and on your experience, is there advice that you'd be giving to members of boards or chair people as they're embarking on this journey, or if they find themselves in the middle of it? What would you be telling them? Oh, sorry, you're still on mute, Tony. I do it every time too.
Sorry. Yeah, good question, Gillian. I think the first thing I'd say is that every company starts in a different place, and every company has a different set of challenges. So there is no silver bullet here, really. I mean, there just isn't. But what I do believe is that two things are pretty fundamental. The first one is, I think for most companies, as I said previously, their climate change strategy will define their business strategy for the next several decades. And that is undeniably true in this sector. And the second one is that, as everyone here acknowledges, but it's not fully acknowledged everywhere today, that if you want to address climate change as a resource company, you have to address the totality of your carbon footprint. The option not to do that is no longer available to us. Denial is no longer possible. You have to confront it and figure out how to deal with it, as we've heard. I think the other thing I would say is that, certainly from my perspective, the thing that I have been most struck with is the pace of change in the last 18 to 24 months. If you go back to the middle of 2019, it was sort of on the agenda, people were engaged with it. We were having conversations with the Climate Action 100, and, we had a few board resolutions, and, there was a dialogue going on. But I have to say, for me, my personal experience of how fast this was changing was going to Davos at the beginning of last year. And I got to the end of the week and I couldn't believe where the conversation was. I mean, I hadn't had a conversation that was not on climate change and ESG. Mm-hmm. And back to what Tom says, it's no longer a conversation with the ESG group. It's the conversation with the guy who's investing the money, or the woman who's investing the money. And we're at an interesting juncture, I think, because the Western institutional capital has moved extremely rapidly in the last 18 months to the point that it's now ahead of most political regulation and policy making. I suspect what will happen at the end of this year with Glasgow is that the policymakers will take another leap forward. That's what I think is probably going to happen. So I don't see this pace of change abating. I think it's going to accelerate and become more intense. That's certainly true in the Northern Hemisphere. I mean, there may be, we may find that there is, beginning of polarization between the Western democracies and other large economies. But the Western democracies have decided. The people have decided, the institutional money that they provide has decided, and the policymakers are now playing catch up, but they're going to play catch up pretty fast through the second half of this year. So I think the pace of change here will continue to accelerate.
Great, thanks, Tony. And I actually remember being in a room with you in Davos, and I think it was 2016 or 17, and we were trying to have a climate and mining conversation, and it was a very difficult conversation to have. I think you were one of the few that was ready to step up and engage on it, and just to hear how that has changed so much. I think, as you said, the pace is with us. One of the conversations we had back then, and it's been brought up by a few, is around the concept of carbon pricing. And I don't know if that's something that you've been thinking about within Glencore, and whether it's a strategy in terms of developing your own roadmap.
Well, look, we have a sort of shadow carbon pricing within the company that reflects broadly the markets in which we participate and how we think they're going to evolve.
Yeah.
But I think it's inevitable that as we go through the next couple of years, the carbon pricing will take a bigger role. We clearly have it in Europe. I think something will happen in the US. We have it in various other places. I think the question that is clearly and will be very important for people in this sector is if, as a consequence of carbon pricing, people begin to introduce carbon border taxes, which I think is quite possible, because I don't really see an alternative if you've got the US and Europe deploying quite high carbon prices and other parts of the world not doing so. It sort of becomes almost inevitable. And that would clearly have a very big impact on all of our businesses, given the sort of global flows that are involved in our sector.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that perspective, Tony. Appreciate that. Tom, if I could turn to you, and it's kind of a similar question, but coming at it from a CEO and leading a management team, you've gone through this journey. What's your advice to other CEOs and C-suite and executive management teams out there who are maybe trying to bring this conversation to their board, or trying to develop their strategy and navigate this journey to race to zero to 2050? What would you be advising?
Thanks, Gillian. And I couldn't agree with Tony more. I came away from Davos in January last year with exactly the same sense. And I think without the global pandemic sitting over the top, I think things might have been much more different through 2020, but it's sitting there right underneath as the world starts to open up again. I think that conversation hasn't gone away. In terms of things that I think about and advice I'd share with others, you must have a strong board. And my view, our view is the board has to be independent and can genuinely support and hold management to account. And we have a safety and sustainability committee, and they're called different names at different companies, but having a strong safety and sustainability committee that we have on that committee, a combination of experts in the world in corporate responsibility. We've got our chair is Jane Nelson, one of the world authorities in that space. We've got Matthew Kuhn-Cohn, an Indigenous leader from Canada. And we have ex-CEOs and their experience, genuine ex-CEOs of public companies who can bring their experience, support, but also hold you to account. And to govern on both the environment and the social responsibility. The two are inextricably linked, and you've got to get the improvement in greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, you must be looking more holistically and holding management to account. Second one is to define what sustainability means in the context of mining and the context of your company. For us, that's about protecting the health and safety of your workforce and the local communities. Never was that more important than the last 12 months, and continues to be critically important. We're still seeing through Latin America, this virus is still wreaking havoc. So it's still fundamentally important that you're advancing through a definition of sustainability, methods and systems and processes that are sustaining what you've done and challenging it to improve, that you're supporting host communities and that you're protecting the environment. And for management to distill that down into a purpose statement and a set of values that can become your true north as you work your way through these challenges. And again, we found through the pandemic, having done that work, how quickly we were able to make decisions as we managed our response because we had clarity on our purpose and clarity on our values as an organisation. And the third one, finally, is to hold yourself to account publicly. Be prepared to report transparently, to be prepared to challenge yourself, to move to TCFD and other reporting mechanisms and beyond, and to set a standard for the industry through your own behaviour, through the systems and processes you put in place, and to challenge your peers to follow. That would be my other advice to other management teams in our industry. Thanks, Gillian.
Great, thanks, Tom. A fantastic roadmap, and Matt used that word too much today, but it really is about setting the steps that we need to take, and we're all working it out by doing, which I think is what Eduardo had said at the beginning. I want to ask you a question on incentives where we finished, and then we've actually got a little bit of time, and so I might pose the question to all of you. Tony mentioned COP26 coming up in November later this year. Obviously, it will be Davos on steroids talking about climate, and there's a really important point, I think, for the mining and metal sector come very quickly recently into this conversation. So I'll maybe come right and ask you all just for a 1-minute comment on what you think is the most important thing for the mining sector as we go into COP26. What will you be thinking about, or what message do you want to give the sector and to the audience here who are also thinking about it? But Tom, maybe just picking up on some of the recommendations that we see around climate governance. One of them is around incentivizing and incentives. And I'm just wondering what Newmont have done thinking about how do you incentivize around your climate strategy?
Gillian, we've had around sustainability or around ESG targets and incentives built into our bonus programs for a number of years. What we're looking to do is we continually have debates around those. Where we've done a lot of work in the last year or two is around our safety metrics. We're moving beyond the traditional lagging metrics to metrics that are leading and looking at fatality risk reduction and challenging ourselves to look to leading metrics that are going to fundamentally change the behaviour around reducing fatalities in our organisation. Building off that, we then come back and have the debate around sustainability, whether it be greenhouse gas emission reduction, whether it be around other aspects of social responsibility, and look for how we can move to leading metrics that are challenging our teams and our leaders to be leading sustainable change. So that is something that we have built into our programs for a number of years, and it's something that's part of an important debate we have every year, both with management and our board.
Great, thanks, Tom. So let me just kind of quickly I'll maybe start with yourself, Eduardo. It's COP26, it's November. You're a leader from the mining and metal sector. Is there a particular message you'd be wanting to give?
Yeah, I think one is maybe obvious here for us. I think a friend of mine said the train has left the station, but I think it got a lot of speed. So we need to align our climate strategy with our business strategy. Otherwise, we're going to be killed. So I think this is maybe obvious. But the second one is a more on the regulatory framework. We need to incentivize the voluntary carbon market. I think for us that has a huge footprint, we are not going to rely everything in offsets, but we need to have a carbon market that is voluntary, is well established, and how can I say, incentivized. That those would be my 2 points and messages.
Great, thank you, Eduardo. Edward, if I could ask the same to you. I'm welcoming you to Glasgow.
Okay, well, let's have a good scotch. Anyway, I'd agree with what's been said before, but also say that there are things that we could do in our business to make a meaningful difference pretty quickly. And, you know, and I'm speaking more broadly here, all the hats that I wear, but the ability to get things approved and permitted, sometimes you could have done the project 3 or 4 times and been moving on to other things. And so there's got to be sort of better cooperation, I think, that between, you might say, industry and regulators, and find a path forward there. You know, if you believe, you know, what Gates and others are talking about in terms of doubling the grid, for example, as a necessary thing for electrification and decarbonization, you know, how do you do that in our lifetime? You know, when you think about the amount of copper and, you know, the conductors that are really required to do that, you know, when it takes 17 years to permit a mine today, and it actually may be 25 years, we just won't know that until 17 years from now. So, you know, how do we, you know, do things properly, but work together in a more constructive way? That's one thing I would add.
Wonderful, thank you, Edward. Tony, over to you.
Yeah, I think the key thing is policy support. You know, the role of it's fundamentally about governments, COP26. The role of governments is to create the policy framework to allow business to operate within. So we need to see, you know, policy support to enable the energy transition, specifically focused, I think, on new technology and technology development and deployment, and as we've already heard, the establishment of a functioning carbon market. Those would be my sort of key areas. But unless there is the right policy support in place, I don't think a lot of what people are aspiring to can actually happen. It certainly doesn't exist today in the way it needs to.
Thanks, Tony. We need all the parts to be successful. Tom, any final words?
Just reinforce the comments from the other three. We have an important role to play. It has to be a global effort, and we have to work in partnership, otherwise we won't get anywhere near where we have to get to.
Wonderful, thank you. Eduardo, Edward, Tom, Tony, I think a really excellent discussion about the role of mining and metals and climate governance from your organisations, but from the sector as a whole. You know, a lot of learnings, a lot of messages. Certainly I have a lot of takeaways to take back as my role as a non-executive director, and thinking how we navigate that. We're on the journey, it's getting faster. And Edward, I'm going to steal your phrase, which was from boardroom to changing room, which is really about how do we, you know, embed this across the organisation, but also the stakeholders that we work with. So I want to say a huge thank you to all of you for this really excellent conversation, and pass it to Olga and Ian, who are going to close for us on behalf of the Climate Governance Initiative of Russia, who are hosting us, and Ian from Deloitte. Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian. The Climate Governance Initiative Russia would like to extend its gratitude to Gillian, our wonderful moderator, and to all our impressive speakers. Let's also thank our partners, Deloitte, Sber, Polus, PBN Hill & Knowlton, and DLA Piper, who share our values and support our goals. Our next panel of the Climate Summit is called Achieving Net Zero Global Oil and Gas Sector. It's organized together with Energy Center Skolkovo, and it takes place tomorrow on March 25th at 3 p.m. Moscow time. We look forward to seeing you there. Ian.
Olga, thanks very much. I know we're right up against the end of the session. But I mean, a really terrific panel. So I wanted to express my gratitude as well to the panelists. I mean, so many quotes. Gillian's already stolen my one from Edward about from the boardroom to the changing room. I thought that was really good. But also, Edward, the point about, you know, I can't remember a board meeting when this hasn't been discussed, and it's about tone at the top. Some great ones from Tony, I think, repeated in both sessions, but about the, you know, the company's approach to climate will define the company's strategy for the next, I think we inserted the word several, but you know, the first time around it was the next decade, but for decades to come, the impact of climate there. Tom, you know, I was struck by the way that Newmont has really embedded the sustainability in the DNA of the organization, you know, this point about continuity, and also your point, I think, in closing in the opening session about, you know, those organizations that are not serious about this will not be around by the end of the decade. So that's quite an astonishing point. I think this point about speed is really interesting, and not only in terms of the transition in terms of investor appetite, but we had I enjoyed a presentation from Tom Friedman, a journalist with the New York Times, but he talks about, you know, and the author of a book Around the World is Flat, which talks a little bit about interconnectivity. He talks about market, Mother Nature, and Moore's law as being real drivers for, you know, sort of acceleration, hyperconnectivity, and, you know, the speed with which not only the industry is adapting and using technology, but also the speed with which the market is expecting and placing these demands on industry, and you know, those changes, I think, are being felt. But just finally, I wanted to come back to those points that Eduardo made in opening comments. I think, you know, in terms of, first off, the pandemic and sort of transformation through adversity, there is an opportunity. If there is anything good about the pandemic, I think it has shown that, you know, we can benefit from cleaner air and cleaner water and better, healthier ecosystems. And so I think that the challenge is, but we have to act now. And I think, therefore, the challenge is to all of us individually and as organizations to provoke not going back to the way it was, but really trying to embed a lot of the changes and to accelerate some of those changes into the future. And the final sort of observation would be, again, with Eduardo, and I think kind of consistent with a number of the other panelists, but the connectivity, you know, the demand to address this challenge requires us to collaborate and to, you know, teamwork at almost an unprecedented scale. You know, and that's across industries, it's working with supply chains. You know, this is for us as an organization, we provoke ourselves about, you know, our role to provide some of that connectivity, working with our clients, with our alliance partners, you know, working with our NGO partners. So, you know, this is something which, you know, it is clear, and the voice from the panel was clear, that this requires this collaboration. So with that, Gillian, Olga, panelists, fantastic session, and everybody joining us, thank you very much for doing that, and very much look forward to tomorrow's session as well, Olga. Thank you all.